Hi, welcome back. I want to continue giving you some additional ideas on this students working collaboratively, working in groups and teams. And I want to introduce you to something called Think, Pair, Share. Now, some of you may have already experienced this in past workshops, and you may be familiar with it in other ways as well, in your own experience. And I present this to you because it's a fairly straightforward, kind of easy way of engaging students in discussion, in working very, very briefly in groups, and very briefly collaborating. But we need to make sure, again, that it's done well. And so that's kind of what we're going to go through here. Now, you may remember from Qilan's introduction to groups and teams, the idea that there are study groups, there are informal learning groups, which is probably what we're talking here about in terms of the Think, Pair, Share activity, and then formal working groups. And she introduced this idea that when you get to the real formal kind of working groups, and we're really talking about a team, and she distinguished between just these informal versus the formal working groups. But again, for the Think, Pair, Share, we're really talking about this one up here, the informal learning groups, because they're only temporarily happening in your classroom. Okay, Think, Pair, Share in a very general sense is a learning strategy that can promote and support higher level thinking. There's several steps to it. Just generally speaking, the instructor asks students to think about a specific topic or address a specific question. So they're lecturing. Oh, okay, let's stop. Now consider this question or consider this topic. Then the instructor asks the students to pair up with another student to discuss their own thinking about the question. So that starts to be the initial component of the share part, or pair in the share part. And then share their ideas with the class. So it is always, you always have to bring that back out. It's not just two students talking together and that's it. Once they talk together, somehow you have to get some of that to emerge and be shared with the class as a whole. Okay. So I've divided this into 5 very specific steps, and we'll go through these one at a time. Prepare the question, the timing, and the pairing, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment. And this very explicitly should be part of your lesson plan. Pose the question. Allow them time to think. Processing time. Do not say, well, what do you think about? And then immediately expect an answer. You can't do that. I cannot do that. So it takes time to process. It takes time for them to actually think. So there has to be some thinking time. Not very long, as you'll see, but some thinking time. And then get them to pair with their neighbor, the student sitting next to them, student behind them, whatever the case may be, and share their responses. This is what I think, and then that other student shares what they think. And then critically, importantly, debrief. Include some student responses, so asking the students, okay, what did you guys come up with in your discussion? And then you must share your thoughts as well, because they want to know what is, quote, the answer. Okay, let's go into those one at a time here. In preparing the question, the timing, the pairing, you want to carefully consider things like, what's the question you're going to ask? So you could do this if you're very comfortable with the topic and you're comfortable giving a lecture and you come along and you say, oh, this would be a good question to ask with a Think, Pair, Share. If you're experienced doing that, and if you're experienced doing the Think, Pair, Share, okay, you can probably pull that off. I strongly recommend, though, that you start out being much more purposeful. That is, you do this before you ever start your lesson, as you're doing the lesson plan for that lesson, and again, this becomes integrated into it. So what is the question? Think carefully about what the question is that you're going to be asking. How much time will you allow for thinking time and discussing time? And we'll get back to that in a moment. How will you manage getting the students into groups? Are you just going to say, turn to your neighbor and talk, or some other way? How many responses are you going to solicit at the end when you're debriefing? And then also, how will you debrief after discussion? How are you going to then provide feedback? Again, these components should be written out in some form. Maybe it's just a sentence for each of these as part of your lesson plan. That way, when you're going through your lecture and you get to the point and your brain says, oh, I think I had a Think, Pair, Share. Where is it now? Oh, yep, here it is, okay. And then you can go through the procedure very nicely. Okay, so one is, what's my question? What's the timing? What's the pairing? And so on and so forth. Write those down. As for the questions, there's multiple types of questions. One is an open-ended question. So here's an example of an open-ended question. What's the best number of students for a group activity? And then why do you think that? You always want to kind of get them to be reflective on that. Why did they come up with that answer? Not just they pulled the number out of the air. So that's an open-ended. They could come up with 2, 3, 100, 1,000, whatever, all right? Or you could be, if you want to kind of narrow that down perhaps, and maybe them having a little less breadth in terms of the possibilities, you could be more discrete responses, provide more discrete responses. Which is the best number of students for a group activity? Why do you think of that? You need to choose between 2, 3, 4 to 5, or 6 to 8. What do you think is best? All right, and so you're giving them only certain choices here. So that's preparing. Pose the question to students. You stand in front of the students and say, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you to think about this question. I want you to think about this topic. Simple. It takes a few seconds to do that. Allow them time to think. They need time to think. They need time to process. So all sorts of things are going on. I mean, they're all going to be having different thoughts and just all over the place. So, and that's okay. That is okay. But you don't give them very terribly long to think. How long do you take? Depends upon the nature of the question. It could be 10 seconds. It could be 20 seconds. Certainly not 5 minutes. Probably not even a minute, because they're fairly quickly going to come up with some thought and response. Now, here's what I recommend you do to help train your students. Because as soon as they have to actually turn to their partner, their neighbor, and start talking, ooh, maybe that thought starts to dissipate a little bit. So another thing you can do is say, well, once you've decided what your response is going to be, sit down and write it down, just a sentence or phrases, and rationale for that response. You might need to give them a little bit longer for that. That way, because what's going to happen is, here I've written down my response. I turn to my neighbor, and my neighbor starts saying something, and I realize, oh, yeah, he or she is right. This is wrong, so I might change my answer. This way it forces them, when you ask them to write it down, at least at that moment, they've made a commitment. They've made a judgment. They've made a commitment. It can change, that's okay. But at that moment, they're pretty crystal clear on what their thought is if they write that down very briefly. That's not something they would turn in. Okay, that's the think, the pairing part. With their neighbor and share their responses. So you're going to ask them to turn to their neighbor. Typically, we think of the pair as being 2. Sometimes, depending upon the class structure, there might be 3. 4 is too many. Typically 2. Turn to the person on your right. Well, somebody on the other end, there's no one on their right. So how do you manage that? How do you get them to pair up? And it's not critical that they have only 2. 3 is okay, 4 is too many in this kind of fairly quick activity. Okay, pair with another student. Turn to your neighbor or neighbors. Share their responses and rationale for that response with their partner, their neighbor, their pair. How long do you give them? A few minutes. A few minutes. So again, this is not really fast. 10 minutes is probably way too long. 3, 5 minutes perhaps, it depends. And here's how you know when to stop. You should be walking around the room. You don't just sit there and twiddle your thumbs waiting for them to get done talking. You're walking around the room, you're listening carefully, you're picking up on, say, misconceptions, so that you know that when you debrief, and listening to some of your conversations, I realized that some of you had misconception, about half of you had a misconception on topic X or whatever. So I need to clarify that. So that's where you pick that up, or part of that. And the other thing is that you can tell by the noise. As soon as let me go back here. As soon as they get to this stage where they turn to the neighbor, the noise level in the room goes like that, or should go like that, because they're talking, all right, and they're listening to each other. But then when that noise level starts dissipating, and you realize, a third of the groups, a half of the groups are no longer talking to each other because they're finished, then maybe you call time. Okay, that's enough time, let's move on and start debriefing. Okay, and then the debrief. So debriefing we're back to order here. Students are back in their chairs, et cetera, and you're back now being the kind of in charge, the authority. Ask several students to share their responses with the entire class, and this could be done by simply saying, can I have some volunteers? You could cold call somebody saying, would you share what you had? Another way is to kind of get the volunteering started. If you're walking around the room listening, you might realize, oh, you know, that person over there had a really nice response. So can I have, or you know, would you share your response with us? Because I thought you had a really interesting approach, thought process on this. And then they can kind of get the ball rolling. They can kind of get things started in terms of the other students volunteering. That's to get their responses. But then you should also share common responses and unique ideas that came from those discussions. Maybe 4 or 5 people said, oh, well, the answer to the question is 4 to 5 students. You say, well, okay, you know, many of you thought that, and so provide some thoughts and feedback on that. Or maybe some others said, well, I think 3 is important because of these reasons, and perhaps then you reiterate those and make comments and feedback on that. So it's validating the idea is that, yeah, they discussed this and they did a great job discussing, and don't ever be shy about telling them that, because that reinforces for them that this is a positive thing to do, these kinds of collaborative efforts. Again, you're reinforcing the idea that, yes, hey, you guys had good ideas. This is a good thing. If anyone learned, and also sometimes ask if anyone learned something new or gained different or unexpected insight from their neighbor. So a student may have an idea and they think it's a great idea, but as soon as they listen to their neighbor, they say, oh, you know, I never thought about it that way. Well, that really changes the way I'm thinking about this. Perhaps they'd like to share that with them, because I'm sure other students in that room also may have learned something new. And that's important to reflect upon that other person's thoughts and ideas. And then be sure that you address the question. They want to know the answer. They always want to know the answer. What do you think? What is your opinion? What is your response to that? Maybe that was the research. So the research says, 3 to 5 or something like that, I think, in terms of group number of students in the group. They want to know from you, the authority, because again, remember, now you are the authority because you've brought the class back to where you're in front of the class and in control. They want to know what the answer is. So don't ever leave them hanging on that. Okay, benefits real fast. Students often find it safer and easier to discuss with another classmate than in a large classroom. Students are actively engaged in the thinking process during this. They have to, you ask them to think. That's what they're doing. Thinking becomes more focused when it is verbalized. Again, you know this. You have this idea in your head. Oh, yeah, I know what I'm talking about. But as soon as you open your mouth, you realize, oh, maybe I don't quite understand that as well as I thought. And it helps them practice and work through that. Discussing and reflecting on the topic enhances the level of critical thinking. Again, one of those skills that we've talked about. Quality of responses improves when given thinking time. So again, this idea, don't simply ask the question and expect an immediate answer. It gives them time to think and to reflect upon that. Building ideas off of others is an important skill. And one of the keys is this think, pair, share idea. It may, because I've had a lot of slides here and I've gone through a lot of detail, but once you practice it a little bit, you realize it's actually very easy to integrate into your lessons. But again, try to integrate it in a purposeful way. These are the 5 steps. Prepare your question, etc. Pose the question, allow time to think, pair up with a neighbor and share their responses, and then your debriefing comes back to what you're doing. Okay. Now I have a couple of assignments for you, and that is to put into practice what we've just talked about in your think, pair, share. So what I want you to do is I want you to pick one of your favorite lectures that you teach, something that you're really comfortable with. You could do it in your sleep. You've done it many times and you're really comfortable with it. And in that, think about, well, can I develop a think, pair, share activity as a means of either introducing it or somewhere during the period of the lecture? When am I going to do it? So am I going to do it 20 minutes in? Am I going to do it 10 minutes in? When am I going to do it? When am I going to do it during the lecture? You want to include in this, write this down, what your question is, how you're thinking about the timing for thinking and sharing, how you're going to organize the pairings. Are you just going to say, turn to your neighbor? That's the easiest thing to say, frankly. How will you manage the sharing? In other words, how long are you going to give them, and are you going to be walking around and so on? And then how are you going to debrief? And then write this out in such a way that it could be plugged into your lesson plan for that favorite lecture that you have. So that's one that should be fairly easy to do. You already know this stuff really well. You can pick up your question pretty well, but you want to think hard about it and then fill in the blanks in terms of the other steps. How are you going to do that? That's the first one, first assignment. The second assignment is now pick one of your least favorite lectures that you teach, something that you're really not as comfortable with, and do exactly the same thing you did for part A. So think, pair, share, and then this is the ultimate question, is how might you use this strategy to enhance both your enjoyment of that lesson, this lesson that you struggle with, as probably the students do as well if you struggle with it, and the understanding of the students. So hopefully this, practice on your favorite, let me go back to part A, practice on something that should be fairly easy for you to come up with. This may be a little bit more challenging to come up with, but hopefully it will help enhance their understanding and enhance everyone's enjoyment of that lecture, making the whole learning experience more positive for everyone. Good luck.